The courtroom was bustling, as it usually was, with people coming and going, waiting for their cases to be called. But today, something felt different. A quiet murmur passed through the room when the woman entered. She walked in with calm confidence, her posture straight and purposeful, yet there was an air of mystery around her. She wasn't wearing a suit like most of the other defendants. Instead, her attire was simple but elegant. Nothing flashy, nothing that stood out too much. But there was something about her. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, or maybe it was the calmness in her eyes. Whatever it was, she had the attention of the people in the courtroom. She took her seat in the defendant's chair, her eyes briefly meeting those of the judge. The judge, a man in his mid-50s, with a slightly graying beard and a stern face, barely looked up as he shuffled through papers. He seemed distracted, already ready to move on with the case. He had seen many faces come and go in this courtroom, and most of them had stories too complicated to care about. But today, this woman intrigued him, even if he didn't quite know why. The case started, and the judge's voice rang out across the room. "Defendant, you are here today to answer to the charges brought against you. I suggest you be brief with your answers." The woman nodded calmly, prepared to speak. But as soon as she began to defend herself, the judge cut her off. "I'm sorry, but that's not how this works," he said impatiently. "We're not here for long speeches. You'll get your chance to speak in the proper order." The woman paused, not offended, but puzzled. She knew how courtrooms worked, but she also knew her rights. She tried again to explain herself. "Your Honor, I would like to speak on the matter of the evidence presented." Once again, the judge interrupted her. "No, I'm not going to listen to your defense until we're at the right point. Do you understand?" Her voice remained calm. "I understand, Your Honor, but I believe I should be allowed to speak now." The judge raised his hand, signaling for her to stop. "I'm sure you do, but you will speak when I say so." His tone was dismissive, as if her words didn't matter. The courtroom filled with a sense of awkwardness as the defendant sat quietly, looking unshaken, but clearly confused by the way the judge was handling the situation. For a moment, there was a strange feeling in the room, a kind of unspoken tension. It wasn't just the judge's behavior that felt out of place. It was the way the woman sat there, so composed, so calm. She didn't seem like the kind of person who would be easily pushed aside. But the judge didn't notice. He was too focused on moving the case along. "I'll make a note here, and we'll continue when you're ready to behave appropriately in court." The judge's eyes were cold, not understanding the power of his own words. The woman was still calm, still composed, but there was something else in her gaze now. It was a mix of patience and something else, something that the judge could not yet recognize. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as the judge's words echoed through the air. He seemed determined to move the case forward, ignoring the fact that the woman had every right to speak. The atmosphere in the room shifted slightly, but it wasn't obvious at first. Most people were too focused on the legal proceedings to pay attention to the unspoken tension building between the judge and the defendant. The woman, however, remained calm, though it was clear that she wasn't happy with how things were unfolding. Her fingers lightly tapped on the edge of the table in front of her, but her expression stayed neutral. She had been in many situations like this before, but something about the judge's dismissive attitude made this different. He wasn't just ignoring her, he was making assumptions about her. And those assumptions were dangerous. The judge, still unaware of who she really was, continued his handling of the case. He looked down at his notes, muttering under his breath, and then spoke again with a sharp tone. "I don't have time for any of this," he said. "We'll continue once you stop interrupting me." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't speak. She wasn't upset, though there was a quiet intensity in the way she held herself. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without standing her ground, but she also knew when it was time to stay silent and wait for the right moment. And she understood how the courtroom operated. But the judge seemed to forget that she, too, had the right to be heard, just like everyone else in that room. "Do you even understand the charges against you?" the judge asked, almost mockingly. "I doubt you do. If you did, you'd know better than to waste my time." At those words, the woman raised her head slightly, a hint of something dangerous flickering in her gaze. The judge, however, was too wrapped up in his own authority to notice the change. He looked at her as if she were a minor inconvenience, a nuisance he had to deal with. In his mind, the case was straightforward. He wasn't going to let a defendant, especially one like her, waste his time. He was the judge, after all, and his word was final. He began speaking over her again, repeating the charges and moving ahead with the proceedings. But there was something about the way the woman listened to him that stopped the judge in his tracks. She was still as a statue, but the power in her silence spoke volumes. He hadn't even noticed that, in his rush to dismiss her, he had already crossed a line. A few moments passed, and then it happened. The woman, still sitting upright, folded her hands in front of her and took a deep breath. She spoke quietly, but her voice carried authority. "Your Honor, I understand the charges," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I have a right to speak on them, and I intend to do so." The judge paused. He looked at her, still unsure of the gravity of what was happening. For a moment, he seemed taken aback, but only for a moment. His eyes scanned her, dismissing her again, unaware that this quiet woman in front of him wasn't just another defendant. He continued to push forward, eager to get the case over with, but the undercurrent of tension in the courtroom continued to grow. Something was about to shift, and the judge had no idea that it was him who was about to be caught in it. The woman waited patiently, a slight but knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She was about to reveal something that would change everything. But for now, she held her silence, knowing that the time for speaking was near. The tension in the courtroom was building. Everyone could feel it, but no one knew what would happen next. The judge, still oblivious to who the woman sitting in front of him really was, continued to speak over her, his tone growing more impatient. It seemed as though he was determined to move the case along as quickly as possible, dismissing the woman's right to be heard at every turn. But the woman didn't react. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue back. Instead, she sat there, perfectly still, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Her eyes remained focused on the judge, but there was something in her gaze, something that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was simply patience. She knew that this moment would pass, and that eventually, things would shift. She had dealt with courtroom moments like this before. As a woman who had fought her way through a world that constantly tried to dismiss her, she was used to people underestimating her. But she wasn't just any defendant in this case. She was someone who had faced challenges and fought for her place in a world that often didn't make room for people like her. And now, here she was, quietly enduring this moment, knowing that the judge's dismissal wouldn't last forever. As the judge continued speaking, the woman's thoughts drifted for a moment. She thought about how far she had come. She thought about the years of hard work, studying the law, fighting for justice, and pushing through all the barriers that tried to hold her back. No one had handed her anything. Every step had been earned. And now, in this courtroom, a judge who didn't know her name or her story was treating her as if she were just another face, another person to move through the system. But she wasn't just anyone. She knew the law better than most people in this room. She understood the importance of fairness, of giving everyone a voice, no matter their status or background. And she knew that it was time for her to speak up. The moment had arrived. But still, she waited. The judge, lost in his own thoughts, continued to speak, dismissing her in the way he had dismissed countless others before her. But he didn't know that this woman was different. He didn't realize that this moment would not pass without consequences. The power that she held wasn't something that could be ignored or brushed aside. And soon, he would learn that lesson the hard way. Finally, when the judge took a breath and paused for a moment, the woman spoke. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of authority. "Your Honor, I am aware of the process. I understand the charges. I also understand that I have a right to defend myself. and I intend to exercise that right." The judge looked up from his notes, surprised by the firmness in her voice. He hadn't expected that response. It was a stark contrast to the way he had treated her up until this point. His eyes narrowed, as if trying to figure out if she was serious. He had no idea that this woman was not just any defendant. She was someone who had earned her place in this world, and no judge, no matter how powerful, would stop her from speaking her truth. The room grew silent. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time since the case began, the judge's confidence seemed to falter. He was unsure of how to proceed. He had underestimated her, and now he would learn that his mistake would come with consequences. As the woman's words hung in the air, the courtroom grew quieter than it had ever been. The judge, who had been so sure of himself just moments ago, looked at the woman with an expression that seemed to shift from confusion to curiosity. His hands, which had been resting confidently on the desk, now fidgeted with the papers in front of him. For the first time, he was unsure of what to do next. The room, filled with people from all walks of life, seemed to hold its breath. The quiet was almost too much to bear, and the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall. The woman, still calm and composed, sat in the defendant's chair, her eyes steady on the judge. She hadn't revealed anything yet, but her presence had changed the entire atmosphere in the room. Unseen by the judge, the whispers started. One by one, people began to recognize her. It wasn't immediately obvious, but those who had been paying attention to the news, those who had been following the latest developments in the legal world, knew exactly who she was. She wasn't just any defendant. She wasn't just a person caught in the middle of a legal case. No, she was someone much more powerful, someone with a reputation that had earned her the respect of the nation. She was the newly appointed Chief Justice, the highest-ranking judge in the country. Her name had only recently made headlines when she was selected for the position, but today no one had connected the dots. She hadn't revealed herself, hadn't let anyone know who she was. She had simply walked into the courtroom as a regular defendant, her true identity hidden under the quiet mask she wore. As the whispers spread through the room, those who knew her name began to share it in hushed tones. "Wait, that's her," one lawyer murmured, barely believing it at first. "That's the Chief Justice." Another person, a clerk who had been quietly observing from the back, nodded in recognition. "I can't believe it. How could he not know?" The judge, still unaware of the shift in the room, continued his attempts to push the case forward. He shuffled his papers, his focus still on the task at hand, but the air had changed. The energy in the room had completely transformed, and the judge had no idea why. People were now looking at him differently, their eyes filled with disbelief. The tension was no longer about the case itself. It was about the reality that he had just disrespected one of the most important figures in the legal system. The woman, for her part, remained still. She had not yet said a word about her true identity, though everyone in the room was now starting to realize who she was. But she wasn't in a rush. She didn't need to reveal anything right away. She had seen the judge's arrogance, the way he assumed his power over her, and now, with every passing second, she knew he would come to understand the weight of his mistake. But there was no anger in her gaze. There was no frustration. She wasn't here to make a scene. She was here for justice, and justice would come in its own time. Her calm, unshakable presence was all that was needed for the moment. The time to speak would come, but for now she waited. And as the realization settled in the minds of those around her, one thing became clear. The judge's fate had already been sealed. His mistake was about to cost him far more than he could have imagined. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet whispers, but the judge was still focused on his papers, unaware of the growing awareness spreading throughout the room. People exchanged glances, some shocked, others curious, and a few even moved subtly to get a better look at the woman in the defendant's chair. Her identity was no longer a secret to those who had noticed the subtle clues, but the judge, busy with the case, had not yet made the connection. As the murmurs continued to ripple through the room, the woman sat still, unmoved by the quiet storm around her. Her gaze was steady and calm, but there was a slight glint in her eyes, as though she was watching the unfolding drama with a quiet understanding. She had known that this moment would come, and now it was time for the judge to learn what he had done. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the judge looked up, his eyes scanning the room. His focus settled on the people around him, who were clearly not paying as much attention to the case anymore. Their eyes were now on him, some with concern, others with disbelief. He frowned, sensing that something was off. The whispers in the room began to reach his ears, and he suddenly realized that the name being passed around was not one he had expected to hear today. The Chief Justice. His mind raced for a moment, trying to understand what was going on. He looked at the woman in the defendant's chair once more, as though seeing her for the first time. The calm, composed woman who had stood up to him, who had dared to challenge his authority, was not just a regular defendant. The pieces began to fall into place, the whispers of recognition from the people around him, the calm but firm way she had spoken, the quiet strength in her presence. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. This was the new Chief Justice, the woman who had been appointed to the highest position in the country's legal system, the woman he had just disrespected, the woman whose rights he had denied. His face turned pale as the weight of his mistake hit him. How could he have been so blind? How could he have not realized who she was? He had treated her like just another person in the courtroom, assuming she was someone he could easily dismiss. But now, standing before him was a woman who held the power to shake the country's justice system, someone who had earned her position through years of hard work, knowledge, and dedication. The room fell silent as the judge's mind raced, and the realization of his error began to settle in. His throat tightened as he struggled to find the right words to correct the situation. He had just insulted the person who had the power to oversee the entire court system. He had insulted the very person who had the ability to determine the fate of the legal world he operated in. The woman remained still, her face unreadable. She had known this moment would come, and now it was time for the judge to face the consequences of his actions. But she wasn't here for revenge or drama. She was here to ensure that justice was served, and that included making sure the judge learned from his mistake. After a long pause, the judge cleared his throat, his voice faltering slightly. "Your Honor, I apologize," he stammered, his face flushed with embarrassment. But the woman did not answer immediately. She simply continued to watch him, waiting for him to understand the full gravity of the situation. And in that moment, the judge knew he would never forget this lesson. The judge stood there, frozen in the silence that followed his apology. His face was red with embarrassment, but he didn't know how to fix the damage he had caused. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but the people present were no longer looking at him with the same respect they once had. Instead, they looked at him with judgment, their eyes filled with quiet disappointment. His authority in the courtroom had been shattered in an instant. The woman, still sitting in the defendant's chair, didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. The message had already been sent. She knew the power she held, not because of her position as the Chief Justice, but because of her strength, her knowledge, and the unwavering confidence she had in her own ability to do what was right. She didn't need to raise her voice to command respect. Her presence alone spoke volumes. As the judge struggled to recover from his mistake, the room remained still. The hum of whispers faded, replaced by a heavy, almost tangible silence. The woman's composed demeanor only made the situation more intense. She hadn't yet revealed her full thoughts, but everyone in the courtroom understood that something significant had just happened. The judge's apology hung in the air, but the woman didn't seem interested in offering him immediate forgiveness. Instead, she took a slow breath, her gaze never leaving him. She knew that the path to true justice was not about making a show of power. It was about ensuring that everyone in the room, from the highest to the lowest, was treated fairly and with dignity. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the room listen closely. "Your Honor," she began, Your actions today have shown that there is still much work to be done in our justice system." The judge looked at her, his eyes wide, as he waited for her to continue. She paused for a moment before going on. "I understand the pressure you may feel in this position. I understand that being the judge can be overwhelming. But the law is not just about who sits in this chair," she said, motioning toward the judge's seat. "It's about the responsibility we all carry to ensure fairness for everyone, no matter their background or status. And in this moment, you have failed to do that." Her words stung, but they were not spoken in anger. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet truth. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of what to say next. How could he defend himself? How could he justify his actions when the very person he had wronged was now speaking with such authority and grace? The woman continued, her tone unwavering. "I could use my power to punish you, to make an example of you. But that's not what justice is about. Justice is about learning from our mistakes, improving, and making sure we don't repeat them." The room fell silent again as everyone absorbed her words. The judge, for the first time, seemed to truly understand the gravity of what he had done. He had underestimated the woman in front of him, but now he saw her for who she truly was, not just a defendant, but a leader, a symbol of fairness, and the embodiment of everything the justice system should stand for. The woman stood up, her eyes never leaving the judge. She was not angry, but she was resolute. "I expect you to take this lesson to heart," she said, "and I expect you to do better, not just for me, but for everyone who comes through this courtroom." The judge nodded, his head lowered in shame. He didn't need to say anything more. His actions had spoken loud enough, and the woman's words had struck deep. The shift in power was clear. Justice had been restored, not by force, but by the quiet authority of one person who refused to be dismissed. The tension in the courtroom had been broken, but it wasn't over. The judge, who had once been so confident, now sat silently, his hands folded nervously on the table. He wasn't sure what to do next, but the woman, the Chief Justice, hadn't finished speaking. There was still more to say, and it was clear that she wasn't finished making her point. The room, which had been filled with hushed whispers, now held a quiet anticipation. People looked at the woman with new respect, their eyes filled with admiration. She had handled the situation with such calmness and grace. And yet, they knew she wasn't done. She was here for justice, and she wouldn't let anyone stand in her way. The woman took a step forward, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "Your Honor, I understand that mistakes happen. We are all human. But the law demands that we hold ourselves to a higher standard, not just because we are judges, but because we are part of a system that is meant to protect everyone equally," she said, her gaze steady as she looked directly at the judge. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had never expected a defendant to challenge him so boldly, especially not in front of everyone in the room. But this wasn't just any defendant. This was the Chief Justice, and she wasn't here to let him off the hook. She was here to make sure he understood the weight of his actions. She continued, "I could easily choose to punish you for your behavior today, but that would not serve justice. It would only add to the problem." Her eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "Instead, I choose to hold you accountable in a way that will teach you, and everyone in this room, a valuable lesson." The judge's face flushed with embarrassment as he realized what she meant. She wasn't here to take revenge. She wasn't interested in making a spectacle out of his mistake. She was showing him a path forward, a way for him to learn from what had happened and become better. It was a lesson in true leadership, and it was something he would never forget. The Chief Justice paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the room. Everyone was watching her now, waiting for what she would do next. The power in the room had shifted, and the judge knew that he had lost control. But it wasn't too late for him to make things right. She took a deep breath before continuing. "Justice is not about power. It is about fairness. It is about making sure that everyone who enters this courtroom is treated with respect, no matter who they are. That is what I stand for. That is what I will always stand for." The judge, now fully aware of the situation, nodded slowly. He couldn't deny what she was saying. He had let his own arrogance cloud his judgment, but now he saw the truth of her words. He had been wrong, and it was time to own up to it. For a moment, the woman said nothing. She simply looked at him, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. She wasn't looking for an apology, but the judge knew it was time to offer one. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "I let my pride get in the way of doing what's right." The Chief Justice nodded, acknowledging his apology. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. "But more than that, I hope you will learn from this moment, so that next time, you will act with fairness and respect for everyone who walks into your courtroom." With those words, the room seemed to settle. The judge had been humbled, and the power of the Chief Justice's quiet authority had been proven. She had not needed to raise her voice or demand respect. She had shown, through her words and actions, what true leadership looked like. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood that this was just the beginning of a new era in the legal system, a time when justice would be the guiding force, not power. The silence that followed the Chief Justice's words hung in the air like a weight, heavy and full of meaning. The judge, his face still red with embarrassment, sat back in his chair, deep in thought. The realization of his mistake wasn't something he could easily shake off. It had struck him hard, and it was clear that the apology he had offered earlier wasn't enough to fix everything. The woman, who had remained calm and poised throughout the entire exchange, now took a step back. She didn't need to say more. Her words had been clear, and the lesson had been taught. But there was still a lingering question in the air. What would happen next? How would the judge move forward from this moment? How would the system, the very system they were all a part of, change after today? The Chief Justice's eyes scanned the room, her gaze steady and full of purpose. She wasn't just looking at the judge anymore. She was looking at everyone in the courtroom. She saw the lawyers, the clerks, the jurors, and even the spectators. They had all witnessed what had just happened, and she could feel their silent acknowledgement. They had seen how power had been abused, how the law had been twisted, and how one person's arrogance could affect the entire system. But they had also seen how the truth had prevailed, how fairness and justice had come through, even in the most unexpected way. The woman took a deep breath, her posture still straight and strong. She could feel the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders, but it didn't scare her. In fact, it only reminded her of why she had taken this position in the first place. She wasn't here for power or glory. She was here to ensure that justice was served for everyone, no matter their position or status. That had always been her mission, and today, she had shown exactly what that meant. The judge, his head still lowered in thought, seemed to realize the gravity of the moment. He was no longer the confident figure he had been at the beginning of the case. The authority he had once felt had been stripped away, replaced by a quiet understanding of just how important his role was. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his career. He was now, in his own way, a changed man. The woman, sensing the shift, decided it was time to move forward. She addressed the courtroom, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable strength. "We all make mistakes," she said, her eyes sweeping across the room. "But it is how we learn from those mistakes that truly matters." Her gaze returned to the judge, and she spoke directly to him. "I hope this experience will be one you remember, not as a moment of shame, but as a turning point, a moment when you chose to grow, to become better." The judge, who had been avoiding eye contact, finally looked up. There was no defiance in his gaze anymore. Instead, there was something else: respect. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I will do better. I promise." The Chief Justice nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile appearing on her face. It wasn't a smile of triumph, it was a smile of understanding. She knew that this was just the beginning of a longer journey, not just for the judge, but for the entire system. Change didn't happen overnight, but moments like this, small, quiet moments of reflection, were the first steps. As the case continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. There was a sense of renewal, of hope for a better future. The Chief Justice had not only upheld the law, but had also shown everyone in that room what true leadership looked like. She had done it with grace, with wisdom, and most importantly, with the unwavering belief that justice could, and should, always prevail. The courtroom, which had once been filled with tension, now seemed to settle into a quiet, respectful calm. The judge, who had been caught off guard by his own mistake, had taken the first steps toward understanding the true meaning of fairness. He had apologized, he had reflected, and now he was ready to change. His posture was straighter, his focus sharper, and the pride that once marked his every action was gone. In its place was something deeper: humility. The Chief Justice, who had watched the entire process unfold, felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't come to the courtroom for revenge or to make a spectacle of anyone. She had come to ensure that justice was done, and more importantly, that the people involved in the system understood the values they were meant to uphold. In this case, it wasn't just about righting the wrongs of the moment, but about setting a precedent for the future. As the judge acknowledged his mistakes, the Chief Justice knew that her work wasn't done. It was a small but important victory, one that would ripple through the system in ways no one could fully predict. But it was enough for now. Change, real change, wasn't something that could be forced overnight. It took time. It took reflection. And it took action. "I trust," the Chief Justice said, her voice clear and strong, "that the lessons learned here today will resonate throughout this courtroom and beyond. Justice is not a one-time act. It is a commitment to fairness, dignity, and respect for everyone, no matter their background or position." Her words echoed in the room, and for the first time, the judge nodded with a new understanding. "Yes, Your Honor. I will do better," he said, his voice steady. He had learned his lesson, and he knew he would never forget it. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. The other lawyers and court staff, who had watched the entire exchange in silence, now seemed to stand a little taller, their own respect for the Chief Justice growing with every word she spoke. They, too, had witnessed something important. It wasn't just about the case being heard. It was about the way the law was meant to work, fairly, justly, and with everyone's rights respected. The Chief Justice's gaze swept over the courtroom one last time, her eyes meeting those of the judge. She had set the stage for something new, and it was up to everyone present to carry that torch forward. She knew that one moment could spark real change, but it was up to those who saw the truth in it to act on it. With a final nod to the judge, she turned and walked out of the courtroom. There was no need for applause or celebration. This wasn't about recognition. It was about ensuring that justice was more than just a word on paper. It was about making sure that the system, at every level, worked for the people it was meant to serve. As the doors closed behind her, the room seemed to breathe a little easier. The tension had lifted, replaced by a sense of hope. The lessons learned today would stay with everyone who had witnessed this moment, shaping the way they approached the law, the way they treated others, and the way they carried themselves in their roles. The judge, though still humbled by the encounter, knew that this moment had changed him forever. He had learned the importance of humility, of recognizing his own limitations, and of the responsibility he held in the courtroom. And as he sat there, alone with his thoughts, he promised himself that he would never forget the lesson the Chief Justice had taught him. That true justice was not about power. It was about fairness, respect, and the courage to admit when you were wrong. And with that, the courtroom returned to its usual rhythm, but with a renewed sense of purpose. The change had begun.